Everyone wants to escape suffering, but where is the path? Hello and welcome back to the Dharma Insights Teachings channel. In our previous videos, we've explored the life of the Buddha, the nature of suffering, and most recently, the concept of clinging, the deep-rooted cause of many troubles we unknowingly create for ourselves. Have you ever felt lost amidst the chaos of life, constantly searching for peace but finding none? Are you tired of the worries, pressures, or endless cycles of unease? If you've ever felt like you're drowning in a sea of suffering, or that life seems to be nothing but struggle, then today's video is for you. We all yearn for happiness and peace. We all want to escape pressure, worries, and the cycles of suffering. But how do we find that escape? Among so many different methods, advice, and paths, which one truly leads us to freedom and liberation from life's burdens? Is there a clear path, a specific roadmap we can follow without stumbling in the dark? Today we won't just talk about suffering, we will explore a concrete roadmap that the Buddha taught to help us find a way out. This is the path to end suffering, one of the most fundamental teachings in Buddhism. It's not an abstract concept, but a practical, specific journey that the Buddha realized and taught to all of us to cease suffering and attain nirvana, a state of absolute peace. We will explore this path, step by step, so you can apply it yourself and find tranquility right in your current life.
1. From recognizing suffering to the way out. Why do we need this path?
Before we dive into the path itself, let's briefly revisit what we've learned. In previous videos, we delved into the three kinds of suffering: suffering of suffering, suffering of change, and all-pervading suffering, and identified that the root cause of suffering is clinging and ignorance, not clearly seeing the impermanent nature of all phenomena. Let's take a very common, everyday example that perhaps all of us have experienced. You suffer because a relationship ends. This is suffering of suffering. But the root of that pain isn't just the separation itself, it's your clinging to the idea that the relationship should remain perfect, or clinging to a person who is no longer meant for you. This is the root cause of suffering, clinging. Or perhaps you feel perpetual pressure, all-pervading suffering, as your career constantly shifts. But the deeper cause might be clinging to the idea of a stable, unchanging career path. Why is this recognition so important? Because if we don't identify the problem and its cause, we will never find a true solution. It's like a sick person who, without knowing their illness and its cause, cannot be cured, no matter how much medicine they take. Buddhism doesn't stop at pointing out suffering. Its teachings always come with a path to overcome them. So, what is the path that the Buddha discovered to escape these burdens, to help us no longer be submerged in the sea of suffering? It is the path to cessation of suffering, dukkha nikrodha gamini patipada ariya satya, within the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths consist of the truth of suffering, dukkha, the truth of the origin of suffering, samudaya, the truth of the cessation of suffering, nirodha, and finally, the truth of the path to the cessation of suffering, magga. Among these, magga, the path, is the Noble Eightfold Path, 8 genuine practices that practitioners need to follow to attain enlightenment and cease the cycle of rebirth.
2. The Noble Eightfold Path, a compass for a peaceful life.
Understanding the nature and cause of suffering is the starting point. Now, the Buddha has shown us a clear path to transcend all suffering, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. The Noble Eightfold Path is not a dry doctrine or a list of lofty principles. Instead, think of it as a detailed map, a practical guide for life, leading you step by step through difficulties towards peace and enlightenment. To make it easier to visualize, we can divide the 8 practices into 3 main pillars, similar to building a strong house. The pillar of wisdom, Panna. This is how you perceive and understand the world around you. It's the foundation for seeing the truth clearly. The pillar of morality, Sila. This is how you live and interact with others and the world around you in a harmonious, non-harmful way. The pillar of mental concentration, Samadhi. This is how you train your mind to become calm and stable amidst all changes. When you apply these principles, you will gradually feel your mind lighten, become clearer, and be less disturbed by external fluctuations. This is a comprehensive, balanced path that gradually frees us from the bonds of clinging and ignorance. So, what does the Noble Eightfold Path consist of? Let's explore each aspect, and you'll find that they are not distant concepts, but are very much applicable to our daily lives, helping us gradually shed unnecessary burdens.
3. Exploring each step on the path. Everyday examples of the Noble Eightfold Path.
We will delve into each limb of the Noble Eightfold Path, turning them into concrete examples to help you easily visualize and apply them. A. The pillar of wisdom, Panna. How you perceive and understand the world. Right understanding, Samadhi. This is the foundation of all liberation. Right understanding isn't blind faith, but a correct understanding of the Four Noble Truths of impermanence, non-self, suffering, and the law of karma. It helps us see things as they truly are, unclouded by illusion or clinging. Everyday example. When work isn't going smoothly, instead of thinking, "I'm always unlucky, life is so unfair to me," right understanding helps you see that everything is impermanent. Work has its ups and downs. This is an opportunity for me to learn, adjust, and grow. Or when facing criticism, instead of getting angry and defensive, you use right understanding to consider if there's truth in the words that could help you improve. Advice for you. Take time to learn and deeply reflect on the fundamental teachings of Buddhism. Don't believe blindly. Verify what you learn in your own life. Right thought, Samma Sankappa, is wholesome thought, free from greed, ill will, and harmfulness. These are thoughts directed towards liberation, compassion, and the benefit of oneself and others. Everyday example. When you get angry at someone for doing something you dislike, instead of dwelling on the thought, "I hate this person, they are terrible," right thought helps you transform it into, "I feel uneasy about that action, but I wish this person finds peace and does not continue to create negative karma." It's choosing wholesome thoughts over resentment. Advice for you. Practice meditation. Observe the flow of your thoughts. Whenever a negative or clinging thought arises, gently acknowledge it and try to transform it into a positive, wholesome thought. B. The pillar of morality, Sila. How you live and interact. Right speech, Samma Vacha. Speech that is truthful, not lying, not causing division or discord, not harsh or abusive, not useless or idle chatter. Right speech brings harmony and peace to both the speaker and the listener. Everyday example. In a conversation, instead of gossiping or speaking ill of others to entertain or create division within a group, right speech encourages you to speak what is true, harmonious, beneficial, and timely. Have you ever realized that a single kind word can brighten someone's cloudy day? Advice for you. Before speaking, ask yourself, is this true? Is it beneficial? Is it timely? Will it cause harm? Right action, Samma Kamanta. Wholesome action, refraining from killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct. These are actions that do not harm oneself or others, but bring benefit and peace. Everyday example. Instead of cheating at work for personal gain, right action means working honestly and putting in your best effort. Instead of being indifferent to others' suffering, you act to help sincerely. Whether you do something beneficial for the environment or help an elderly person cross the street, these are all right actions. Advice for you: practice compassion towards all beings. Support those in need, protect the environment, and live responsibly within your community. Right livelihood. Sama ajiva. Earning a living through honest means that do not harm sentient beings. Avoiding professions involved in weapons, poisons, slavery, animal slaughter, or deceiving others. Everyday example: choosing a job that you feel has meaning and doesn't harm anyone. For instance, a person who practices organic farming has right livelihood more than someone who produces addictive substances. Earning money through honest work not only helps you live a stable life, but also brings much more peace to your mind, freeing you from worries about negative karma. Advice for you: reevaluate your profession. If possible, choose work that benefits society, or at least does not cause harm to anyone. C. The pillar of mental concentration, samadhi. How you train your mind. Right effort, sama vayama. The correct effort to prevent unwholesome states from arising, to abandon unwholesome states that have arisen, to develop wholesome states that have not yet arisen, and to maintain wholesome states that have arisen. Everyday example: you want to lose weight to be healthier, a wholesome goal. Right effort is exercising daily, even when tired, not giving up. You want to break a bad habit like procrastination, an unwholesome state. Right effort is persistently refraining from it even when temptation arises. Diligence is the flame that keeps your journey moving forward. Advice for you: don't be discouraged by difficulties. Set small, realistic goals and persevere every day. Right mindfulness, sama sati, right remembrance of what is happening in the present moment without clinging to the past or future. Right mindfulness helps us clearly perceive all our sensations, thoughts, and actions. Everyday example: instead of mindlessly eating while looking at your phone, right mindfulness is savoring every taste and texture of your meal. Instead of worrying about a future interview, you focus on your breath in the present moment. Right mindfulness is like an anchor that keeps you in the present moment, preventing you from being swept away by the waves of anxiety from the past or future. Advice for you: practice mindfulness meditation daily, even if just for 5 to 10 minutes. Pay full attention to your breath, to what you are doing, eating, walking, talking, completely. Right concentration, sama samadhi. Concentrating the mind on a single object, eliminating all distractions to achieve a state of deep tranquility. This is a higher development of right mindfulness, helping the mind become steady and unshakable. Everyday example: when you work, right concentration helps you focus entirely on that task, undisturbed by messages or social media, thereby increasing efficiency and quality. In life, the ability to keep your mind calm, undisturbed by external worries, helps you solve problems effectively and feel deep inner peace.
4. The Noble Eightfold Path in your life, a journey, not a destination. You see, the Noble Eightfold Path is not a checklist for you to tick off or strive to complete mechanically. It is an integrated path where each element supports and reinforces the others. When you practice right understanding, correct view, you will have right thoughts and right speech, correct thoughts and words. When you speak and act truthfully, right speech, right action, right livelihood, your mind will find it easier to concentrate. Right mindfulness, right concentration. And from that, your wisdom, right understanding, will become even clearer. So, how can you apply the Noble Eightfold Path in today's busy life most effectively? Start small. You don't need to change everything at once. Choose one or two aspects of the Eightfold Path that you feel easiest to practice and begin there. For example, practice right speech by only speaking kindly for one day, or practice right mindfulness by paying full attention to your meal without doing anything else. Observe and self-adjust. This journey requires patience and continuous self-reflection. Whenever you feel suffering, pause and ask yourself, which aspect of the path am I deviating from? Am I clinging to something? Are my words or actions creating suffering? Don't seek perfection. There will be times when you stumble and cannot practice perfectly. That is completely normal. The important thing is that you recognize it and gently return to the path. Remember, the path to ending suffering is a continuous journey, not an immediate destination.
5. Conclusion. Embracing the path, rising from the mud.
The path to end suffering that the Buddha taught through the Noble Eightfold Path is an invaluable gift to humanity. It does not promise a life without difficulties, but it shows us how to face difficulties without being overwhelmed by suffering. Just like the lotus flower, which grows from mud, yet rises to bloom purely and untainted by the mud, we too can rise from the sufferings and defilements of life to achieve peace and enlightenment. Practicing the Noble Eightfold Path will gradually lighten the burdens of clinging and ignorance, bringing you inner peace, compassion, and wisdom to live a complete life. This is a path you can begin today, step by step, right within your own life. What do you think about the Noble Eightfold Path? Which of these 8 practices resonates most with you and makes you want to start practicing it today? Please share your story and thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear about your experiences. If you found this video helpful and wish to continue exploring profound Buddhist teachings with us, please like this video, share it with those who might need it, and don't forget to subscribe to the Dharma Insights Teachings channel so you don't miss our next videos. See you soon as we continue to unlock the path to peace and enlightenment.